The hum of the air conditioner was the only sound between us. That sterile corporate chill that somehow made people speak softer, as if the cold itself could freeze emotions midair. I sat across from Lydia Barrett in a room that smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant and burnt coffee. The blinds were half closed, cutting slices of light across the long glass table. I could see my reflection in the glass, faint and doubled, like someone ghosting through her own life. "Skylar," Lydia said, using that careful HR tone that made bad news sound like an opportunity, "we've reviewed your compensation request. 12% is, frankly, not realistic." Her words floated across the table like ice cubes clinking in water. I nodded once, expressionless. She mistook it for acceptance. I was only keeping myself from laughing, because I knew exactly how much my work had saved this company in the past year. I had numbers, charts, proof. I had caught 3 compliance breaches that could have cost Luminar Tech millions, but in this room, that didn't matter. Revenue mattered, optics mattered, not the quiet work of keeping a company legal. "Of course," I said softly, "I appreciate the review." Lydia smiled the way people do when they think they've won something small but symbolic. She tapped her Mont Blanc pen against her folder. "You should be proud of the stability you bring, Skylar. Compliance isn't glamorous, but it's necessary. We count on you. Count on me, but never count me in." That was the unspoken rule. She looked down at her notes. "We just have to balance expectations. The board been clear about maintaining salary structure parity. I'm sure you understand." I did understand. I understood that parity meant keeping me in my box. It meant they'd rather pay a new account manager $20,000 more because he brings in contracts, while I prevent the lawsuits that could destroy those contracts. Invisible work, invisible worth. "I understand perfectly," I said, still calm. "So the decision is final?" Her eyes flicked up, uncertain for a fraction of a second. "Yes, it's final." The silence after that line was a living thing. I let it breathe. Let it stretch so long that she finally shifted in her seat. I could almost hear the tick of her smartwatch as she checked the time. I stood slowly. My reflection moved with me, faint in the glass. "Thank you for the clarity," I said. When I opened the door, the sound of office chatter spilled in. Laughter. Keyboard clicks, the clink of coffee mugs, life going on oblivious. My hand lingered on the doorknob a moment longer than it needed to, as if my body was giving me one last chance to swallow the insult and stay small. But I had already decided. Something in me had tilted. It wasn't rage yet, just the subtle shift before an earthquake. Outside the conference room, the floor buzzed with fluorescent light. The motivational posters on the wall declared things like "Excellence SDARTS with you and Teamwork BUILDS tomorrow." I walked past them all, each one like a tiny lie. My desk waited at the far end of the open space, tucked in a corner near the copy machine that coughed paper dust into the air every few hours. I sat, opened my laptop, and stared at the inbox filled with problems no one else could fix. Contract disputes, legal wording, vendor certifications. The same endless cycle of cleaning up messes others created. And all I could think about was that single word Lydia had used: unrealistic. 12%. Unrealistic. I opened a spreadsheet I wasn't supposed to have. I'd found it by accident weeks ago, left open on a shared drive by some careless junior HR associate. The file listed every salary in my department. I'd memorized it. People with half my experience made more. A man who joined last year already outearned me by $15,000, and they had called my request unrealistic. I closed the file and exhaled slowly. Not angry yet, not even surprised. Just done pretending that being indispensable meant being valued. The rest of the day passed in fragments. A call from legal. A policy review. A Slack message asking if I could quickly double-check something before end of day. By 6 p.m., the office emptied, leaving only the hum of the vending machine and the faint sound of rain against the windows. I stayed another hour. Out of habit, not duty. Sometimes you stay late because you do know where else to go. When I finally stepped out into the rain, the city lights turned the pavement silver. My reflection shimmered in every puddle, the woman who never broke a rule, who believed good work spoke for itself. Maybe that version of me deserved to be underpaid. I reached my apartment around 8. It was small, minimalist, everything in its place. I poured a glass of red wine, opened my laptop again, and pulled up the performance review Lydia had mentioned. Consistent, reliable, stable. Words that sounded like compliments but felt like chains. I closed the file. I wasn't sure yet what I was going to do, but I knew I wouldn't forget this day. Some moments brand themselves into you quietly, like a seal pressed into wax. The next morning, the office buzzed louder than usual. People moving faster, whispering about restructuring. I'd heard the rumor before. It always started like this, a few random meetings, then a wave of pink slips. I didn't think much of it until my calendar pinged. Meeting request, 2 p.m. HR and Ops alignment. Sent by Lydia Barrett. I stared at the screen for a full minute. The subject line was too clean, too calm. I clicked accept. The digital equivalent of signing your own execution notice. At 2 sharp, I walked into conference room B again. Same lemon disinfectant, same fluorescent hum. But this time, Lydia wasn't alone. Next to her sat a young man with perfectly parted hair and an iPad. He looked barely old enough to rent a car. "Skylar," Lydia said warmly, gesturing for me to sit. "This is Nathan. He's shadowing HR operations this quarter." An intern. She brought an intern to my termination meeting. I almost smiled. Lydia folded her hands, voice coded in that artificial empathy they must teach in corporate seminars. "As you know, Luminar Tech is undergoing strategic restructuring to better position us for future growth." The phrase was so rehearsed I could have finished it for her. Strategic restructuring, a polite synonym for cutting costs. "Your position," she continued, "has been identified as redundant. We're consolidating compliance responsibilities under the legal department." She slid a folder across the table. I didn't touch it. My eyes moved between her and the intern. Nathan was taking notes, meticulously, as if this were a case study for his ethics class. "I see," I said. My voice sounded steady, detached, even to my own ears. "And the separation terms? 2 weeks severance plus accrued vacation," Lydia said. "We believe that's more than fair." 2 weeks. 12 years reduced to 2 weeks. I opened the folder finally. The agreement was printed on thick ivory paper, heavy enough to feel important. Paragraph 4 caught my eye, a clause about exempt status. No overtime compensation. I read it again, slower this time, the words burning into me like acid. They had classified me as exempt, as if I were a manager with authority, but I had never supervised anyone. I had no budget control, no signing rights. It was a technical violation, small but sharp. The kind of thing that multiplied across departments could gut a company. "Skylar," Lydia said gently, "I know this is hard, but this isn't personal." That was the phrase, they all used it, nothing personal, as if turning a person into a statistic excused everything. I looked up at her. "Of course, business decisions rarely are." She smiled, relieved, mistaking civility for surrender. I stood, closed the folder, and thanked her for her time. On my way out, Nathan gave me a sympathetic look. Maybe he thought this was a lesson about resilience. Maybe he'd learn the real lesson later, when he saw what resilience could do to a system built on exploitation. Outside, the sky had darkened into a heavy gray. I walked past rows of glass offices, faces glowing blue in the light of screens. My badge still worked at the elevator. My reflection looked back at me from the polished steel, same calm posture, same tidy bun, same pale lipstick. But the eyes had changed. I wasn't angry. Anger burns too fast. What I felt was something cleaner, cold and precise. The kind of feeling that builds systems, not destroys them, though sometimes those are the same thing. By the time I reached the parking garage, the decision had formed, quiet and complete. They thought I would sign the papers, collect the 2 weeks, disappear. They thought wrong. That night, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and the separation folder spread open like a map. My apartment was silent except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. I read every line, every subclause, every comma. The law was my language. I'd spent 12 years defending Luminar Tech from fines, audits, sanctions. I knew their vulnerabilities better than anyone. They had made 2 mistakes. First, they assumed I wouldn't notice the misclassification. Second, they forgot that I was the one who knew exactly where to send the proof. I closed the folder, turned off the lights, and walked to the window. The city was still alive out there, streaks of light reflected on wet glass towers. Somewhere in one of those towers, Lydia was probably writing my exit email template. "We wish Skylar all the best in her future endeavors." I smiled. My future endeavors were about to involve them more than they could imagine. I opened my laptop one last time that night and created a new document titled Notes for Clarity. My fingers hovered over the keyboard before typing the first line. "Regarding classification standards for compliance staff without managerial authority," then I stopped, saved it, closed the laptop. Not yet. Timing was everything. Revenge wasn't a storm, it was weather. You had to know when to open the window. The next morning, I woke before dawn, made coffee, put on the same black blazer I'd worn for my termination meeting. Habit, not irony. At 8 on the dot, I logged in for my final day of work, technically still employed until end of business. My inbox was flooded with system alerts, access changes, transition notices, security confirmations. One line caught my eye: account deactivation scheduled for Monday, 8 a.m. I opened a new draft email. The cursor blinked like a pulse. For a moment, I just watched it. Then I closed the window without typing a word. Too soon, too emotional. There would be no threats, no accusations, only precision. By 10, my coworkers started dropping by my desk. The polite condolences, the pitying smiles. "We'll miss you. You've been such a rock. You'll land somewhere great." I smiled back each time, the same polite curve of lips. They thought I was leaving quietly. I was already writing the first chapter of their downfall. Around noon, Lydia appeared again, hovering by the cubicle wall. "Skylar," she said softly, "I just wanted to make sure you're okay." "I'm fine," I said. "I'll finish my transition notes by end of day." "Good," she said, relief slipping into her tone. "You've always been so professional." Professional, that word again. The way she said it made me wonder if professionalism was just the corporate term for self-suppression. When she walked away, I watched her reflection in the computer screen, shrinking with every step until she vanished into the blur of the office. I opened a new folder on my drive, named it Archives. Inside it, I began to gather documents: memos, policy drafts, time logs, emails. 12 years of invisible labor compressed into data. A record not of what I did for them, but what they did to me. As the sun dipped low that evening, the city outside turned gold, then gray, then black. The office emptied again, one light at a time. I sat alone until the cleaning crew arrived. When they asked if I was still working, I said yes. Technically, I was. When I finally walked out, I looked back once at the building. The Luminar Tech logo glowed high above, bright white against the night sky. It looked solid, permanent, untouchable, but I knew better. I'd built enough systems to understand how fragile structure really is when the foundation starts to crack. That night, as I lay in bed, sleep wouldn't come. My mind replayed Lydia's words, the intern's nervous note-taking, the phrase, "nothing personal." I turned those words over and over until they lost meaning. Nothing personal, everything personal. In the darkness, an idea began to take shape, clean and elegant. I didn't know then that it would burn down an empire. I only knew that when people treat your silence as compliance, the loudest thing you can do is whisper at the right moment. And that whisper was already forming in my throat. I woke up that Friday before sunrise, long before my alarm. The city outside was still half asleep, a dull glow rising behind the skyline. I sat on the edge of my bed and listened to the silence. I had always liked mornings like that, calm, logical, predictable. Today, that silence felt like the moment before a verdict. The email had arrived the night before, sent at 9:47 p.m., when people assumed others had stopped checking their inbox. But I always checked. "Please join us for a brief alignment discussion regarding your transition plan," it said. Transition. Another word they'd sterilized until it no longer resembled its meaning. I showered, dressed, tied my hair back in the same smooth knot as always. My reflection in the mirror was composed, precise. No anger, no panic. My calmness had always unsettled people. They mistook it for indifference. They didn't realize it was the armor you learn to wear when you spend years in a world that pretends competence is emotionless. At 7:40, I left the apartment. Portland was gray and wet, a film of drizzle blurring the morning lights. My bus stop was half empty. I watched people scroll their phones, lost in their own worlds, an accountant reading emails, a teenager with noise-canceling headphones, a mother in a bright yellow raincoat holding her daughter's hand. I used to envy their detachment from consequence. My work was the opposite of that, a constant balancing act of cause and effect. A single overlooked clause could mean disaster. I wondered how many of them knew that their quiet mornings depended on someone like me somewhere, unseen, making sure the world didn't break. The Luminar Tech building rose from the street like a glacier, glass, metal, the company's name etched in white across the top. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of espresso and wet umbrellas. I swiped my badge. It still worked. I almost laughed at the irony of being fired by a system that still let me in. At my desk, I checked my calendar. 2 p.m., HR alignment. Beneath it, a smaller notification blinked. System permissions update. Effective Monday, 8:00 a.m. The machine had already begun deleting me. I spent the morning clearing my inbox, replying to people who didn't know I was leaving yet. "Thanks, I'll take a look. Let's revisit next week. Sounds good." Words that meant nothing now but maintained the illusion of continuity. At 11, I walked to the break room. The coffee was burnt again. The machine blinked a red warning light ignored by everyone. I poured it anyway, black and bitter. At exactly 2 p.m., I walked into the conference room. Same lemon scent, same flickering light. Lydia was waiting, wearing her usual beige suit, her smile carefully arranged. This time, there was no intern. Just her and a man I recognized from legal, Dennis Palmer, one of those quiet corporate lawyers who existed in every large company, ghostly and deliberate. "Skylar," Lydia said, "thank you for joining us. Please sit." I sat. The folder was already on the table, its contents visible under the clear plastic cover. Separation agreement, benefits schedule, confidentiality clause. I didn't touch it. Lydia clasped her hands, rehearsed warmth in her eyes. "You know, we've been restructuring departments. The board made the difficult decision to consolidate compliance under the legal division." Dennis adjusted his tie but said nothing. Lydia continued. "This means your position will no longer exist after today. You'll receive 2 weeks' pay, plus your remaining vacation balance." Her tone was almost cheerful, like a teacher explaining grades to a child. "We truly appreciate everything you've done for Luminar Tech. You've been a valued member of this family." Family, I almost smiled. They loved that word. It cost them nothing and meant even less. I opened the folder. My eyes went straight to paragraph 4, the one labeled compensation and classification. I had already memorized its phrasing from the draft version. Employee acknowledges exempt status as defined by company policy. The words blurred together in the sterile rhythm of legalese, but beneath them I could already see the fault line. It was small, technical, and powerful. A misclassification that wasn't just wrong, it was illegal. I kept my expression neutral. Lydia and Dennis were watching me like handlers studying an animal. They expected resistance. They expected negotiation. What they didn't expect was silence. "Do you have any questions?" Lydia asked. "No," I said. "It's clear." Dennis looked relieved. "That's good to hear. We'll need your signed copy by tomorrow. It will help you with transition access." Lydia added quickly, "And Skylar, please remember, we're here to support you through this change." Support me, I thought, like a chair being pulled out from under someone is support. "I appreciate it," I said. I stood. Lydia extended her hand. I shook it. Her fingers were soft, manicured, careful. She smiled again, that professional empathy so polished it barely looked human. As I turned to leave, she said, "I just hope you understand this isn't about performance." I looked back just once. "I understand perfectly," I said. "It's about efficiency." Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second, then she nodded. "Exactly." In the elevator down, my reflection followed me again, calm, neat, unbroken, but my mind was already shifting gears. Compliance wasn't about emotion. It was about systems, patterns, loopholes, and I had just found the biggest one they'd ever left open. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the folder spread out like a battlefield. The apartment lights were dim, and the rain against the windows made a steady rhythm that matched my heartbeat. I read every page, every clause, every hidden trap. Lawyers wrote documents like spells, meant to bind you without your consent. But I knew the language. I knew where it cracked. At the bottom of page 3, I found it again. Exempt status maintained throughout employment. It was a throwaway line to most people. To me, it was an admission of guilt. Exempt employees didn't receive overtime pay, but I had worked 60-hour weeks for years, weekends, holidays, middle-of-the-night calls. None of it compensated. None of it documented in payroll, but all of it recorded in my own files. My logs, my proof. I pulled up the drive I had built over the years. Folder after folder of reports, timestamps, approvals. Every project, every saved contract, every night I worked past midnight while others slept. I had 12 years of data. Enough to rebuild or destroy an empire. They thought they were cutting costs. They didn't realize they were cutting the person who knew exactly how to expose them. I made tea, strong and dark, and stood by the window watching the lights of downtown flicker on. Somewhere out there, Lydia was probably having dinner with her husband, telling him how hard her day had been. I wondered what she'd say if she knew the storm she'd just triggered. I didn't plan to send the email yet. Timing mattered. Information was power, but timing was leverage. If you wanted to make the right impact, you had to strike not when they expected it, but when they thought they were safe. I opened a new note on my laptop and typed one sentence. Department of Labor Classification Standards Inquiry. Then I minimized it and shut the lid. Not tonight, not yet. The weekend passed in silence. Saturday morning, I went for a walk by the river. The air smelled like wet steel and pine. My mind was calm. There was no anger left, only clarity. Revenge, when stripped of emotion, becomes strategy. Sunday, I went grocery shopping, cleaned the apartment, organized the shelves. I knew Monday would be the last day my badge would work. There was something poetic about it, a system executing itself exactly on schedule. Predictable, precise, inevitable, like everything else I had built for them. Sunday night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how many times I'd fixed things quietly so others wouldn't notice. I'd saved this company more than once. And for what? So someone like Lydia could call me stable. Around midnight, I got up, sat at the kitchen table again. The folder was still there, illuminated by the light from my laptop. I took a deep breath and began to type. Dear Lydia, thank you for the separation documentation provided Friday. I am reviewing the terms carefully, particularly the statement in Section 4 regarding my exempt status for clarity and accurate record-keeping. I'm copying the Department of Labor for verification of classification standards for a compliance role without direct reports or budget authority. I have detailed time logs available if needed. Best regards, Skylar Love. It was polite, sterile, unthreatening. A request for clarity, nothing more. But it was the kind of clarity that could burn down a building. I didn't send it yet. I saved it as a draft. The cursor blinked at the end of the message, patient. The world outside was quiet. My reflection in the window looked like a stranger, calm, sharp, inevitable. Monday morning came gray and heavy. I dressed the same way I always did. Coffee, blazer, black heels. Routine was my armor. When I arrived at the office, the security guard nodded. He didn't know it was my last day. Maybe no one did. The elevator ride felt longer than usual. The mirrored walls showed my face from 4 angles, each one identical, unreadable. At my desk, I logged in one final time. My access still worked. For now, I opened my email, the unsent message waiting in drafts. The subject line glowed at me. Separation agreement, classification clarification. At 8:00 a.m., I hovered my mouse over the send button. For a moment, I thought of all the years that had led to this, the late nights, the ignored warnings, the quiet obedience. Then I clicked. The email flew into the system with a soft whoosh. That small sound felt like thunder. 30 seconds later, the read receipt appeared. Lydia Barrett. Read at 8:00:31 a.m. I could almost see her face as she reached the CC line and realized what I had done. The message wasn't a complaint. It wasn't even an accusation. It was a simple request for clarification and a copy to the one government agency capable of destroying them. I closed my laptop and leaned back. Outside, the rain had stopped. The sky was still gray, but there was a strange light breaking through it, pale, deliberate, cold. The kind of light that shows everything you'd rather keep hidden. I knew what was coming next. Panic, denial, damage control. I had seen it before, companies scrambling to fix problems they refused to admit existed. This time, I wouldn't be fixing it for them. I packed my things slowly. A few notebooks, a plant, a photo of my mother smiling under the sun. I left the framed certificate of appreciation on the wall. It looked better there, collecting dust. When I reached the lobby, Lydia was already calling. Her name lit up on my phone screen. I let it ring, again and again. By the time I stepped outside, there were 3 missed calls and 1 text. Skylar, please call me immediately. We need to discuss your email. This is unnecessary, please call. I turned off my phone. For the first time in years, I felt weightless. That afternoon, I went to a small cafe across from the river, ordered a black coffee, sat by the window, and watched people hurry past in the drizzle. The barista smiled at me like I was just another stranger with nowhere to be. She was right. For the moment, I wasn't anyone's employee, anyone's subordinate, anyone's problem. I was free, and that freedom had already started a fire. By the time I finished my coffee, I knew Luminar Tech was burning quietly from the inside. The email was only the match. The fuel was everything they had ignored. 12 years of negligence, arrogance, and greed stacked like paper, waiting for a spark. I didn't need to see it to know. You could always tell when a machine started to fail. It was in the silence between its noises. The way the rhythm shifted. The way people started whispering instead of speaking. When I left the cafe, the air felt cleaner. The rain had stopped completely. The city glistened under a weak sun, reflections shimmering across glass towers. For the first time in months, I walked without looking over my shoulder. I wasn't sure what would come next. I only knew that whatever they called efficiency, I was about to redefine it. When you press send, you expect the world to stay the same for at least a moment. It never does. The act is small, mechanical, almost silent, but everything changes in that blink. I sent the email at exactly 8:05 in the morning. By 8:30, my phone began to vibrate. By 9, the first wave of calls started. I didn't answer any of them. I sat in my kitchen with my second cup of coffee, the morning light sliding slowly across the counter, and watched the city move outside my window as if nothing had happened. That was the beauty of precision. The world looked calm right before it began to burn. At 9:21, Lydia's name appeared on my screen again. Then Dennis from legal. Then an unknown number that I knew belonged to someone further up the ladder. I silenced them all. Every vibration of the phone was a heartbeat from inside the building I had just set on fire. I wondered how long it would take them to understand that my message wasn't a threat but a mirror held up to their own negligence. I imagined Lydia opening her inbox, scanning the email, seeing the CC line. The first wave would be confusion, then panic. Then fear disguised as professionalism. I had seen it happen to others before, just never from this side of the glass. Around 10, I opened my laptop again. My inbox had already filled with automated responses. Out of office, delivery confirmation, read receipts, but one stood out. A single line from Lydia. "Skylar, please call me immediately, we can resolve this." No punctuation, that was new for her. Punctuation was control. She was losing it. I closed the message and looked at the clock. I imagined the office, the whispered conversations, the way the air must have felt charged. There was a rhythm to chaos, you could almost conduct it. At 10:40, I received another message, this one from Dennis. "Miss Love, we need to schedule an immediate discussion regarding your correspondence. Please confirm availability." I smiled. Correspondence, they couldn't even call it what it was. Fear hid best behind formal language. I typed back 2 lines. "Mr. Palmer, I am reviewing my separation agreement as instructed. Since I'm no longer an employee after today, I believe all communications should go through proper channels. The Department of Labor has been copied for transparency." Then I hit send. After that, I turned my phone face down and went for a walk. The air smelled like rain and concrete. Portland was alive with the usual noise of late morning traffic, but I felt detached from it all, as if walking through a film where the sound had been slightly muted. The world didn't know that somewhere, a corporation was unraveling because of one polite email. That's the thing about power. It never looks the way you expect it to. It's quiet, it's clean, it's calm until it is. When I returned home around noon, the storm had reached full speed. My voicemail count was at 14. Text messages stacked one over another. Lydia again, Dennis, a new one from Grant Ellison, the CFO. "Skylar, this is Grant. I think there's been a misunderstanding about your terms. Please call me before you take any further action. We can resolve this." That word again. Resolve. They loved resolving things before anyone else saw the damage. I didn't reply. I made tea instead. The kind I used to drink during audit weeks when my eyes blurred from staring at compliance sheets. Earl Grey, 2 minutes, no sugar. The routine steadied me. Across the street, a neighbor's window was open. Music played softly, an old jazz record. I let the sound fill the silence. My mind was clear, no guilt, no hesitation, only the slow awareness that something irreversible had begun. By 3, the second stage would have started at Luminar Tech, internal review, legal escalation, containment mode. They'd be tracing email access, calling emergency meetings, drafting statements. Someone would suggest reaching out to me with a higher offer. Someone else would panic about potential exposure. I knew their playbook better than they did. I had written half of it. They would go through the 5 predictable phases: denial, justification, negotiation, suppression, surrender. I was patient enough to wait through all 5. At 3:47, an email arrived from an address I didn't recognize. No subject line, only a screenshot attached. It showed a Slack message from Lydia to the executive team. Code read, "Skylar Love has involved DOL, need immediate exposure assessment. All hands Monday 7 a.m. Code read. I laughed out loud. I had seen that phrase exactly 3 times during my career there. Once when the FBI investigated a client. Once when a government contract failed inspection. And once during a data breach. It had never been used for a single employee, until me. I sat back in my chair, the laughter fading into quiet satisfaction. They had turned me invisible for years. Now they were calling an emergency meeting over my name. I poured another cup of tea and toasted the empty air. To visibility. The next few hours unfolded like a silent film I'd already watched. My inside sources began to whisper. Janet from accounting sent me screenshots. Sarah from sales texted updates. Tom from IT reported that the Slack channels were being archived and replaced. They were erasing their footprints in real time, deleting messages, renaming files, pretending that deletion was defense, but I knew the system. Every action left a trace. Every attempt to hide evidence wrote a new line of guilt. By 5, I had another message. Marcus, the security guard who'd always joked with me during late nights, texted, "Hey miss, just saw them moving boxes out of HR storage. Shredding company logo on the van. Thought you'd want to know." I smiled. "Thank you, Marcus," I typed back. Then I forwarded the message to my personal attorney with one short note: evidence preservation. When the sun began to set, my apartment was filled with the warm orange light that makes everything look softer than it really is. I sat on the floor by the window, surrounded by stacks of old folders and USB drives. Deborah, my cactus, stood on the windowsill, small and stubborn, a green sentinel. "They're panicking," I told her. She didn't answer, obviously, but I liked to think she listened. At 7:20, another screenshot arrived, this time from David in benefits. "Lydia just asked me to pull access records for the employee classification database. She looked pale when she saw your name appeared 873 times. I stared at the number. 873. Every one of those was a moment I had tried to fix the system. Every one ignored, dismissed. Now they'd all become proof. I saved the screenshot. The beauty of data is that it never forgets. At 8, I cooked dinner for the first time in weeks. Nothing fancy. Pasta, olive oil, garlic. The ordinary act of cooking felt strange, like rediscovering something human after years of mechanical living. The phone buzzed twice while I ate. I ignored it. I ate slowly, deliberately, as if tasting freedom itself. Later that night, I received another photo. A whiteboard inside a conference room. Someone had snapped it through a half-open door. In red marker, the words "payroll audit prep, do not discuss" were written at the top. Underneath was a list of names. Mine was at the top, circled 3 times. The message included one line from my anonymous source: "They're in full lockdown." I stared at the photo for a long time, feeling something between victory and pity. Not pity for the company, that machine deserved to collapse, but for the people still trapped inside, who hadn't realized yet that loyalty was never going to save them. When the clock passed 10, I poured myself a small glass of wine. The city outside shimmered in the reflection. I thought of all the years I'd spent walking that same street at midnight, the weight of work sitting on my shoulders, convincing myself it mattered. Now, for the first time, it did, just not in the way they had intended. The next morning, a new email came in from Lydia. "Skylar, please, we can resolve this without regulatory involvement. Grant is prepared to discuss a revised package." I read it twice, the desperation bleeding through the politeness. Then I typed back, "I'm simply seeking clarification. If everything was done correctly, there's nothing to worry about." I clicked send, finished my coffee, and smiled. They were negotiating with their own reflection. Around 11:30, Grant called again. I answered this time. His voice was smooth, careful, the tone of a man who had built an empire on charm. "Skylar, I think there's been some miscommunication. Could we meet for coffee?" "Neutral ground," I said. "I'm afraid I'm quite busy preparing documentation for the department's review." He paused. "Documentation? 12 years generates quite a paper trail," I said. "I'm sure you understand accuracy is important." There was silence on the other end. When he spoke again, the charm was gone. "What do you want?" I smiled into the empty room. "I wanted fairness," I said. "Now I just want truth." Then I hung up. By afternoon, the internal chaos had reached public ears. A friend from a local business journal texted, "Rumors about Luminar Tech. You hearing anything?" I replied, "Just that clarity is contagious." She sent back a laughing emoji. That night, she would publish the first anonymous note about a pending investigation. At 6, I stood by the window again. The city looked peaceful. You'd never guess a storm was gathering under its surface. In the distance, the Luminar Tech logo glowed faintly against the gray sky. I wondered if Lydia was still at her desk, fingers shaking as she typed emails she knew were too late. I imagined the meetings, the frantic calls, the blame shifting. I had seen that dance before. Only this time, I was the music. I slept better that night than I had in years. The sound of rain on the windows felt like applause. The dream I had was simple. I was standing on the roof of the Luminar Tech building, the wind cold against my face. I didn't jump. I just turned and walked away. When morning came, I woke to sunlight breaking through the clouds. My phone was quiet. No new calls, no new messages, the calm before discovery. I made coffee and sat at my table with my laptop open. A new email notification popped up. Unknown sender. "This is Margaret Chen from the Department of Labor. We've received your inquiry and other reports about Luminar Tech. We'll be initiating a preliminary investigation. Please retain all relevant documentation." I read it 3 times, then closed my eyes. It was beginning. Officially. I stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the skyline. Somewhere in those towers, people were about to learn what accountability looked like. For 12 years, I had kept them safe. Now I was simply letting gravity do its work. You can only hold something up for so long before it learns what falling feels like. I whispered to my cactus, "Here we go, Deborah." And then I smiled. The morning they walked into Luminar Tech, I wasn't there to see it, but I could picture every second. The automatic doors sliding open with that quiet hiss. The 3 inspectors from the Department of Labor stepping into the gleaming marble lobby. Their badges catching the light. Their shoes clicking against the polished floor where I used to walk every morning with a coffee I barely had time to finish. I knew the exact smell in that lobby, the faint mix of citrus cleaner and ozone from the screens. It made me smile to think of it filled with silence instead of corporate greetings. By 9:17, my phone started to light up. The messages came in like a chain reaction. Janet from accounting, Marcus from security, Sarah from sales. They all wrote some version of the same sentence. "They're here." The tone behind those words carried years of fear disguised as loyalty. I could almost hear the tremor in their typing. 3 inspectors had commandeered conference room. Grant was already pale. Lydia had run past Marcus's desk without her shoes fully on. The Slack channels had gone dark. The company had gone into maintenance mode, which was just another way to say panic mode. I sat at my kitchen table, my coffee untouched. The steam had long since vanished, but I wasn't ready to move yet. I wanted to imagine it. The glass walls of the conference room reflecting the nervous faces, the executives whispering behind closed doors, the team leads trying to look busy while their screens refreshed every few seconds. It must have been beautiful in a way. Justice never looked loud. It looked like stillness in a room full of people who suddenly had too much to lose. At 10:30, a photo arrived from Tom and it. Someone had managed to snap it through the narrow window on the executive floor. Grant was standing by a whiteboard covered in numbers, his face flushed, one hand gripping his tie. Dennis Palmer was on 3 phones at once. Lydia sat with her head in her hands. The title on the presentation screen behind them was simple and devastating: Critical Response Protocol. I saved the photo. I didn't need to look at it again. I just liked knowing it existed. Around 11:45, the first big mistake happened. Tom messaged again. Someone from HR had tried to delete the shared payroll drive. The system flagged it immediately. The deletion was blocked because the Department of Labor had already issued a preservation order. The action was logged. I could almost hear Dennis's voice echoing down the hallway, the same calm voice he used when explaining compliance policy. Now that tone would tremble. That single keystroke had turned a civil investigation into a potential criminal case. I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes, and let the soundless applause play in my head. By noon, the cafeteria would have been quiet. I could imagine the clusters of employees whispering in corners, afraid to open their laptops, afraid to ask questions out loud. They would be thinking about their paychecks now, not their loyalty. The whispers would spread faster than any memo ever could. Rumors were always the first truth in a collapsing company. I checked the clock. It was time to eat, but I wasn't hungry. Instead, I stood by the window and watched the gray sky rolling over the city. It felt strange to know I had caused a storm I could not see. Strange and satisfying. The inspectors were just doing their job, but I knew I was the ghost haunting that building now. Every fluorescent flicker, every low conversation, every trembling hand on a keyboard carried my name even if they didn't speak it. At 2:30, Janet sent another update. Emergency all-hands meeting in 15 minutes. I pictured the email landing in everyone's inbox. Attendance mandatory. They'd gather in the main hall, pretending calm, pretending control. The CEO, Jonathan Whitfield, would stand at the podium. He always looked confident, silver hair perfectly in place, voice measured. But not today. Today, even his voice would crack. Janet's next message confirmed it. He told them the company was cooperating fully with a routine review. Routine. That word must have sounded so thin as it left his mouth. Employees asked questions about their jobs, their pay, their safety. He gave them nothing real, just phrases polished by years of corporate training. We're confident in our processes. We take compliance seriously. We value every member of this family. Words like paper shields trying to stop a flood. At 3:47, Marcus texted, "Lydia's here at your building." I froze for half a second. Then I walked to the window and looked down. The rain had started again, soft but steady. She stood at the entrance in her beige coat, hair frizzing slightly in the damp air, pressing the buzzer repeatedly. I didn't move. She kept her finger there like the sound might bring me back into her control. It didn't. After 20 minutes, she left an envelope with the doorman. Then she walked quickly back to her car, her heels slipping on the wet pavement. I watched the taillights disappear into traffic. The doorman brought the envelope up 10 minutes later. She said it was personal, he said. I thanked him, waited until he was gone, then opened it. Inside was a personal check for $50,000 and a handwritten note on company letterhead. Personal loan, no strings attached. Please call off the dogs. I stared at it until the handwriting began to blur. Not from emotion, from disbelief. They had turned bribery into an act of kindness. I took a photo of the check and the note, then slid them back into the envelope. I would send it to my attorney later. Evidence always needed proper labeling. At 5 o'clock, the first article appeared online. Davenport Dynamics had been the name in the original script of my life, but here it was Luminar Tech under fire. The Riverton Business Journal headline was brutal and precise. Luminar Tech under federal investigation for wage violations. The article quoted anonymous sources describing a culture of misclassification and pressure. It didn't name me, but anyone who knew the story would see the outline of my shadow in every paragraph. I closed the browser and poured another glass of wine. I didn't need to read the details. I had written them in another language months ago. The evening passed quietly. The sky outside turned from gray to black. The city lights shimmered in the puddles below. My phone buzzed one last time around 8:43. A message from a friend in finance who still worked there. Insurance company on a call. They said fraud isn't covered. Grant threw a mug at the wall. I could picture it perfectly, the arc of the mug, the shatter, the coffee splatter like some abstract painting of failure. The image made me laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was human. Panic always stripped people to their truest selves. I spent the rest of the night organizing my digital folders. Every piece of evidence labeled, every timeline clean. 7 years of emails, memos, meeting notes, warnings that had been ignored. Each file a small piece of history that no one wanted but everyone deserved. The rhythm of sorting them was soothing. Every click, every drag, every rename was a quiet act of closure. Close to midnight, a new text came from an unknown number. The message was short. You've made your point. What will it take to end this? I didn't recognize the number, but I didn't need to. I knew the tone. It was the sound of fear pretending to be reason. I typed back 3 words. Justice isn't negotiable. Then I turned off my phone. I slept soundly. No dreams this time, just darkness, clean and deep. In the morning, sunlight poured through the window. The air smelled like new beginnings. I stood in front of the mirror, brushed my hair, and smiled faintly at the reflection that looked back. The lines under my eyes were softer. The calm wasn't forced anymore. There's a moment after a storm when the world feels too quiet, too still, as if holding its breath. That's what it felt like. Later that morning, a call came from Victoria Hartwell at Nexus Ventures. We had spoken months ago about Aurora, the compliance software I had been building in secret. She sounded different now. Focused. Urgent. Skylar, I'll cut to the chase. Luminar Tech has made compliance the hottest topic in the state. We've had 3 companies call this week begging for automation solutions. Your software is exactly what the market needs. Her words hung in the air. For a moment, I didn't say anything. The irony was too perfect. They had tried to erase me, and in doing so they had built the demand that would make me rich. I suppose timing is everything, I said. It is, she replied. You lit the match at the right time. Are you ready to scale? Yes, I said. I've been ready for years. We spoke for 20 minutes, outlining terms. By the time the call ended, I had an investor meeting scheduled for Friday morning. The same day Luminar Tech would hold its emergency board review. Life had an exquisite sense of symmetry. That night, I walked down to the river again. The water reflected the lights of the bridges, rippling softly. I thought of the people still sitting in that building, rewriting policies, hiding files, pretending the ground wasn't giving way beneath them. I didn't hate them. Hate was too loud, too heavy. What I felt was cleaner. A quiet knowing that balance had finally been restored. I looked up at the Luminar Tech Tower one last time. The lights on the top floor flickered faintly in the mist. I whispered to the air, not sure who I was speaking to, maybe Lydia, maybe the version of myself who once believed loyalty mattered. You taught me the cost of being invisible, I said softly. Now everyone can see what that costs you. The wind off the water carried my words away. I turned and walked home. Tomorrow would be the first day of something new, not revenge, evolution. I had built a system that would outlive them, and I was finally free. The day after the first article broke, Luminar Tech was no longer a company. It was a rumor with walls. Every phone line in that building must have been buzzing, every inbox blinking red. I didn't need anyone to tell me what was happening. I could feel it in the rhythm of the city. When you've lived inside a machine long enough, you can hear it when the gears start to grind. At 9 that morning, I walked to the cafe by the river again. The same window seat, same black coffee. The barista recognized me and smiled. "Busy day ahead?" she asked. I almost laughed. Something like that. Outside, the streets shimmered with the pale light of early spring. Somewhere behind those glass towers, chaos was rewriting its schedule. By 10:15, my phone started again. Not calls this time, but messages. The first was from Janet. They brought in outside counsel. 2 lawyers from Chicago, full lockdown. The next one came from Tom. "They just disconnected half the internal servers. They think someone's leaking." I texted back a single word. "Someone is." At 10:30, the second article appeared online, this one from a national outlet. The headline was colder, more deliberate. "Federal probe expands into tech firms' wage practices." No name, just the implication of scale. I scrolled slowly, watching the story unfold like a mirror version of my old reports. They used the same phrases I once wrote in memos: compliance failures, misclassification patterns, violations of the Fair Labor Standards Act. It was strange, reading my own language returned to me like prophecy. Around 11, I received a call from Victoria at Nexus Ventures. "Skylar," she said, breathless, "the timing couldn't be better. Everyone's talking about compliance automation. We've had a dozen inquiries since last night. Are you ready to finalize your prototype demo?" I looked around my apartment. The sunlight fell across my desk where my laptop waited, code frozen on the last line I'd written months ago. "Yes," I said. "Let's finalize it," she laughed. "You sound calm. I've been preparing for this for a long time." "I believe you," she said. "I'll send the paperwork by end of day." When the call ended, I stared at the ceiling for a moment. I had built Aurora compliance systems on nights when I couldn't sleep. It started as a tool to make my own job easier, to track compliance gaps automatically. Over the years, it became something else, a way out. I'd spent months coding, testing, feeding it data. It could analyze entire departments in minutes. If Luminar Tech had used it, none of this would have happened. The irony made me smile. By noon, the story had spread. Financial blogs, industry forums, Twitter threads, Luminar Tech's name was trending. Investors panicked. The board must have been trapped in that building, spinning stories for whoever would still listen. I made another cup of tea and opened my laptop. My inbox was filled with LinkedIn messages from recruiters, reporters, and former colleagues. Some were polite, some wanted information. A few offered sympathy. I didn't answer any of them. Silence was still my best weapon. At 2 that afternoon, Marcus texted again. They just carried boxes of files out of the CFO's office. Paper everywhere. "Lydia's crying." I stared at the message for a long moment before typing back. "She'll survive." He replied, "You're not scared they'll come after you?" I took a sip of tea before answering. "They already did. This is just the reply." At 3:15, a notification popped up from my attorney. He had received a new email from the Department of Labor confirming that formal investigation orders had been signed. Attached was a scanned copy of the document, stamped in blue. My name wasn't on it, but I didn't need it to be. I closed the file and sat still for a while, listening to the sound of my own breathing. For years, I had worked in compliance, protecting companies from exactly this kind of scrutiny. Now I had turned the process into a weapon. At 4:30, another update from Janet. They called an emergency board meeting. "Everyone in there. Grant looks like he hasn't slept. Lydia's desk is empty." I typed back, "Keep your head down." She sent a thumbs-up emoji. The casual gesture made me laugh. Even in the middle of collapse, people still reached for normalcy. The light outside began to fade. I turned off my laptop, opened a bottle of wine, and stood at the window. The Luminar Tech Tower glowed faintly across the river. One by one, the lights in its windows started going dark. By 7, only the top floor remained lit. It looked like a sinking ship, its bridge still burning. The next morning, the storm went public. The Department of Labor issued a statement confirming an ongoing investigation into wage violations at a major Portland tech firm. Every news site picked it up within hours. The company's name trended again. By midday, their corporate website was down. The homepage redirected to a maintenance notice. I received another call from Victoria. "Skylar," she said, "Nexus wants to move fast. We're ready to fund Aurora. Full seed round, multi-million valuation. We'll announce next week." I smiled. "Perfect timing." She paused. "You sound like you planned it." "Not the chaos," I said, "just the opportunity." The day passed quietly after that. I wrote for hours, refining Aurora's documentation. The more I wrote, the more I realized how much of my old work had built this foundation. Every warning ignored at Luminar Tech had become a line of code here. Every dismissal had turned into logic that would save others. It wasn't revenge anymore. It was efficiency, perfected. At 6 that evening, I received a new text from Janet. "It's over. They're shutting down 2 departments. Lydia resigned." I read it twice, feeling something close to relief, but not quite. It wasn't happiness. It wasn't triumph. It was equilibrium. For years, they'd called me unrealistic for asking for fairness. Now the scales had evened themselves. The following day, the 3rd article hit. Luminar Tech faces record fines after federal probe. The headline sat at the top of every business feed. I didn't click on it. I didn't need to. I knew the story by heart. That afternoon, I walked through downtown for the first time since this began. The air was crisp, the river calm. People hurried past me with phones pressed to their ears, unaware that the story they were reading had started in a small apartment across the water. I passed by a bookstore and stopped at the window. A display caught my eye, a book about corporate ethics and modern justice. The title made me smile. It said, "Invisible Hands." I almost bought it, but I didn't need a reminder. I lived it. That night, I finished the final lines of code for Aurora. The program compiled cleanly, no errors. When the confirmation window appeared, I leaned back and exhaled. On the screen, the logo glowed faintly, a simple circle of light with a single word beneath it. Aurora. I saved the build and closed the laptop. Outside, rain had started again, tapping softly against the window. I poured a drink and sat by the window. The reflection of the city danced in the glass. In the distance, the Luminar Tech sign flickered once, twice, then went dark. I didn't know if it was coincidence or symbolism. Maybe both. I whispered to the empty room, "That's enough." For the first time in years, I felt finished. Not with work, not with life, but with the endless need to prove my worth to people who never cared. They had called me stable, reliable, predictable. They were right about one thing. Stability can destroy as effectively as chaos if you withdraw it at the right time. I slept deeply that night. When I woke, the city was bright and clear. The air smelled of wet stone and coffee. I opened the curtains, sunlight spilling across the floor, and realized I was free from every obligation that had once defined me. Luminar Tech had fallen, Aurora had risen. The balance was complete. I made coffee and raised the mug slightly toward the distant skyline. "Good morning," I said softly. Then I smiled and started the next chapter. The first investor meeting for Aurora took place on a Thursday morning that smelled of new rain and ambition. The office Victoria had arranged for me was a shared space overlooking the river, minimalist and bright. White walls, steel beams, the kind of design that made people think about progress. I arrived early, coffee in hand, laptop tucked under my arm, heart steady. For the first time in years, I wasn't walking into someone else's company. I was walking into mine. Victoria arrived 10 minutes later, a blur of energy in a gray suit and red sneakers. She set her bag on the table and grinned. "You ready to make history?" she asked. "Not history," I said. "Correction?" She laughed, a sound that filled the room. "Same thing depending on who's writing it." The investors came at 9. 3 of them, representing a venture group known for backing precision software. They introduced themselves quickly, already scanning their tablets for notes. The oldest, a man named Keen, smiled at me over his glasses. "We've heard interesting things about you, MS Love. You've built quite a reputation lately." I met his gaze. "Reputation is just data interpreted emotionally." He laughed softly, spoken like a compliance officer. We began the presentation. I projected Aurora onto the screen, clean interface, glowing blue lines of data. As I navigated through the dashboard, the system analyzed a mock company's records, flagging violations in seconds. Automated summaries appeared, each one linked to regulations, complete with recommendations. "It's not just automation," I said. "It's prevention. A company shouldn't find out it's guilty after the fact." The room went silent as the system finished its analysis. Victoria leaned forward. "Imagine this applied to 10,000 employees across multiple departments," she said. "Imagine compliance without fear, without guesswork." Keen nodded slowly. "It's elegant," he said. "Too elegant to be an accident." "It's not," I said. "I built it from every mistake I was paid to fix." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the youngest investor, a woman named Alicia, asked, "Is this related to Luminar Tech's current situation?" I didn't flinch. "No more than cause is related to consequence." Her lips curved. "Fair enough." When the meeting ended, they shook my hand. "We'll send over terms by tomorrow," Keen said. "If this works as you've shown, Aurora could define a new category." It already has, I said. After they left, Victoria dropped into the chair beside me and let out a long breath. You just detonated a bomb made of logic, she said. Congratulations. I smiled faintly. It was overdue. We spent the afternoon finalizing the paperwork. By the time I signed the last page, my fingers trembled slightly. Not from nerves, but from the weight of finality. I was no longer an employee, no longer a ghost. I was the founder of something alive. That night, I took a walk through downtown. The air was cool, filled with the hum of streetcars and voices. On one of the digital billboards, an article headline flashed briefly: Luminar Tech faces historic fine. I stopped for a second, watching the words dissolve into an advertisement for a car. The city moved on, indifferent. That's how justice works. It doesn't wait for applause. The next day, the news spread further. Luminar Tech's stock froze, its board resigned, its CEO vanished from public view. The company's name became shorthand for failure. People online debated what had gone wrong: mismanagement, arrogance, oversight. Only a few guessed the truth, that it was none of those things alone. It was underestimation. Victoria called that evening. They're offering $12 million, she said. Equity or cash? Equity, 40% valuation. That's the full seed. I closed my eyes, letting the number settle. Take it. You don't even want to negotiate? I already did, I said. They just don't know when it started. After the call, I opened a bottle of champagne I'd been saving for no particular reason. I poured one glass and carried it to the window. Across the river, Luminar Tech's tower was dark. Only one light glowed on the top floor, the legal department, probably. I raised my glass to it. You should have read the fine print, I whispered. The next few weeks blurred into movement. Meetings, calls, signatures. Aurora grew faster than I could track. We hired a small team of engineers, mostly freelancers who'd left corporate jobs for freedom. I liked them. They were young but sharp, unscarred. They reminded me of who I had been before the years of silent obedience. We worked in a rhythm that felt like breathing. Code, coffee, laughter, silence. At night, when everyone left, I stayed behind, walking through the office in the quiet. The hum of servers replaced the old sound of fluorescent lights. I liked that trade. Then one morning, Victoria called me with something in her voice I hadn't heard before. Worry. Skylar, you might want to see this. She sent a link. A news article again. Exclusive, former Luminar Tech employee behind competing compliance startup. My name was right there in the first line. They had found me. I sat still for a long time. The article wasn't cruel. It was factual, even admiring in tone, but it drew the line between Luminar Tech's collapse and Aurora's rise too cleanly. The timing was no longer coincidence. It was revelation. I read it twice, then closed the browser. Victoria called again. Do we respond? No, I said. Silence is stronger. They might come after you legally. They won't, I said. They can't. Everything I used is public. Everything they hid is what destroyed them. She hesitated. You're sure? Yes, and even if I wasn't, they don't want to open that box again. The following week, Luminar Tech filed for bankruptcy. The Department of Labor issued its official report. Over 1,000 employees had been misclassified. Millions owed in back pay. Fines that exceeded the company's cash reserves. The report didn't mention me, but the narrative had already filled in my outline. Whistleblower, architect, avenger. People love names for things they can't control. On the day the final report went public, I sent a single white envelope to Luminar Tech's headquarters. No return address. Inside was a small card. 3 words handwrit, "Thank you sincerely." That night I sat alone in the Aurora office, the lights dimmed, the city outside glowing. I opened the system and ran the newest test scan. The algorithm finished in 30 seconds. The result appeared in clean blue text. 0 violations detected. The irony was almost too much. For the first time, the world I'd built was compliant. The phone buzzed again. Victoria, still working late. Skylar, she said, I just wanted to say this feels like the start of something big. It is, I said. It's not just software, it's accountability. She laughed softly. You're not going to rest, are you? I've had enough rest for 12 years. After she hung up, I turned off the lights and stood by the window. The reflection that stared back at me wasn't the same woman who had once sat in HR's office waiting for permission to be valued. This version stood taller, quieter, sharper. The city moved beneath me, indifferent and alive. I could almost hear the hum of power lines, the pulse of a world that didn't know it had changed. I reached for the plant on the windowsill, the same small cactus that had survived every move, every storm. Its tiny thorns caught the light. We made it, I told it. Finally. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall. The sound was soft, rhythmic, endless. I watched it streak the glass until the city lights blurred into watercolor. I wasn't angry anymore. The revenge was done, the empire rebuilt. What remained was something quieter, deeper. Freedom disguised as peace. When I finally left the office, I didn't look back. A year had passed before I realized how quietly success had settled around me. Aurora had grown beyond what I imagined. We had offices now, real ones, filled with people whose names I didn't have to memorize because they stayed. The system had been adopted by half a dozen major firms. We were the standard. I read that word once on a client review and smiled at how strange it sounded. For years, I had been the deviation. Now I was the rule. The Portland skyline looked different from this side of the river. I had rented the top floor of a converted factory, open ceilings, exposed brick, wide glass panes that caught every sunset. At night, the reflection of the city glittered across the river, and sometimes, if the wind was right, I could still see the faint ghost of the Luminar Tech logo on the distant tower. The building hadn't been sold yet. It stood hollow, like an artifact of an extinct belief. I kept a single photo on my new desk. It wasn't of people, but of the old office corridor where I used to walk every morning. The lights were flickering, the carpet worn. I had taken it years ago by accident, just trying to capture something ordinary. Now it looked like a relic from another life. Every morning, I arrived early before the team came in. I liked the quiet hum of the servers warming up, the distant gulls over the river, the slow rhythm of coffee machines starting their day. I would stand by the window, cup in hand, and think about how far things had shifted. I had built an empire from the pieces of one that ignored me, not out of spite anymore, but out of symmetry. On one of those mornings, Victoria came in early too. She leaned against the doorframe, watching me. "You still come in before everyone," she said. "Old habits," I replied. "Even habits evolve," she said. "You can let go now." I turned toward her and smiled. "Maybe I just like knowing the system starts before anyone else touches it," she laughed. "The system works, Skylar. You don't have to keep proving it." "I know," I said, "but it's not about proof anymore. It's about remembering what silence used to sound like." We stood there for a while, watching the sunlight climb over the water. The city woke slowly, unbothered by its own history. Somewhere, a construction crew hammered steel into place. The sound carried across the river, rhythmic, steady. It reminded me of something pure. Later that week, I received an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a folded newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Former Luminar Tech Executive Joins Educational Nonprofit." Below it was a photo of Lydia Barrett, smiling beside a group of students. She looked older, softer, lighter somehow. At the bottom of the clipping, someone had written in neat handwriting, "People change." I didn't know who sent it. I folded it back carefully and placed it in my drawer. I didn't feel anger or triumph, only a quiet acceptance that everyone finds their way to atonement differently. That night, I walked along the riverfront. The air smelled like wet pavement and cedar. Couples passed me, laughing. A street musician played an old song I half remembered from childhood. I stopped for a moment, listening. The melody carried something gentle, something human. I realized then that my story had stopped being about vengeance a long time ago. It had become about weight and the act of finally setting it down. When I got home, I poured a glass of wine and opened the sliding doors to the balcony. The city lights shimmered below. From here, everything looked orderly, almost peaceful. But I knew better. Beneath every skyline, there are always cracks. Systems pretending to be whole. People pretending not to notice. That was why Aurora existed, not to punish, but to protect. I had created a way for truth to exist without needing a war. That thought made me smile. The next morning, I woke to a message from the Department of Labor. They were adopting Aurora's framework as part of their new pilot program. Government partnership, full integration. It was the kind of message that changes the shape of your life without warning. I stared at it for a long moment, then forwarded it to Victoria with one word. "Approved," she replied a minute later. "You did it." "No," I typed back, "we did." At noon, I gathered the team for coffee, 20 people in a bright office, faces glowing with pride. "We've been officially recognized," I told them. The room filled with cheers, applause, disbelief. I let it wash over me like a wave I didn't need to control. They deserved it. I watched them celebrate, remembering what it felt like to be invisible. I swore silently I'd never let any of them feel that way under my roof. When the noise died down, I said one more thing. "Do good work," I told them, "but more importantly, do fair work, because fairness outlives everything." That evening, when the office emptied, I walked through the rows of desks, each one still warm from use. I touched the back of one chair, ran my fingers along the smooth surface of a computer screen. These were small rituals of gratitude. At the window, the reflection looked back at me, not younger, not harder, just complete. I thought of the first day I walked out of Luminar Tech, the rain, the fear, the strange calm. I remembered the sound of that email leaving my outbox, the way silence followed it like a shadow. I had no idea then how far it would reach. Maybe none of us ever really know the distance our smallest choices travel. Maybe we only learn when it's too late to turn them back. A week later, I was invited to speak at a business ethics conference. It was ironic, but I accepted. When I walked onto the stage, the lights were blinding. Rows of faces watched me, notebooks ready, cameras blinking. I told them about systems, about responsibility, about how compliance isn't paperwork, it's empathy. I told them that power without transparency always breaks. When I finished, they applauded, but I didn't feel pride. I felt peace. The kind that comes from saying what you once needed to hear. After the conference, a young woman approached me. She looked nervous, holding a folder to her chest. "I'm in compliance too," she said. "Sometimes I think no one sees us." I smiled. "That's what they used to say about me, but they will. Just keep your records, keep your conscience. The rest will find you." She nodded, eyes shining, and I saw a reflection of who I'd been years ago. Invisible, patient, waiting for her moment. That night, I returned to my apartment late. The air was still. I poured a glass of water, stood by the balcony, and looked toward the distant tower again. The Luminar Tech sign had finally been removed. Only an empty metal frame remained, catching the last light of the setting sun. I raised my glass to it one last time. "Rest," I said softly. Inside, my phone buzzed with another message from Victoria. She wanted to discuss expansion, a second office in San Francisco, maybe London next. I smiled. I'd let her dream of growth. My dream was simpler. Balance. I sat down at my desk and opened my journal, a habit I'd started after the storm. I wrote one line. "We don't destroy to win, we reveal what was already broken." Then I closed it. The rain began again, faint and steady, the kind that sounds like memory. When I finally went to bed, I left the curtains open. The river shimmered in the distance. I could see the faint lights of the Aurora office glowing like constellations in glass. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to plan the next move. The machine was running without me. The story had learned to breathe on its own. In the quiet, I thought about what Lydia had once said, that this wasn't personal. She had been wrong. It had always been personal. Every rule I enforced, every report I filed, every law I turned into armor. But personal didn't mean vengeful. It meant human. And for the first time, I felt entirely that. Before sleep found me, I whispered a final truth to the dark. I never brought them down, I just stopped holding them up. The city lights flickered outside, and somewhere across the water, the world kept spinning, clean and alive, as it always does after the storm ends.